At the end of May, the Israeli Knesset called for a second election, and I said I wouldn't do another party rundown. Because there was no precedent for 2 elections in a single year, I assumed that the various parties wouldn't have enough time to change or evolve in a meaningful way. I was wrong. Several of the parties I mentioned in my video no longer exist, several new parties have taken shape, and many of the rest have changed their leaders. In the previous rundown, I broke the parties down into government and opposition, but since Israel doesn't really have a government right now, that's why there's another election happening, I'm going to break these down into 3 blocks. The right religious bloc, the center-left Arab bloc, and the unity bloc. Now, if you're looking for info on a specific party, you can skip ahead to the timestamps I've linked in the doobly-doo below. Let's start with Israel's ruling party. The Likud party is led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and has been the largest party in the Knesset since 2013. As previously stated, it has drifted significantly rightward over the years, favoring economic privatization and deregulation, general opposition to organized labor, continuing and strengthening the occupation of the West Bank, and as of this summer, reducing the power of the Supreme Court to do judicial review. But really, at this point, the Likud's main issue is keeping Netanyahu in power indefinitely and immunizing him from prosecution. As Israel's security situation has deteriorated over the past year, Likud has turned away from the traditional campaign of Netanyahu kept us safe and has increasingly flaunted the Prime Minister's strengthened ties to far-right world leaders like Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, Narendra Modi, and Vladimir Putin. To Likud's right is Yamina, it literally means rightward, led by Ayelet Shaked. Yamina's platform includes disenfranchising Arab Israelis, annexing the West Bank into a greater Israeli state for the Jewish people and only the Jewish people, slashing taxes and regulations, and eliminating labor unions through right-to-work laws. Yamina was formed through a merger of the New Right and the United Right, and while the latter organization is now disaffiliated with the terrorist group Otzma Yehudit, current high-level candidates for Yamina have continued to express interest in implementing halacha, or Jewish religious law, as the law of the land. So you can throw theocracy on there as well. Now onto the ultra-Orthodox parties. These parties have easily changed the least since the last election, so this should be easy. United Torah Judaism, led by Deputy Health Minister Yaakov Litzman, is foremost a voice for the more insular Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox communities and is guided by a self-appointed rabbinical council called the Sages. It opposes LGBT rights, public transport on Saturdays, supports the continued exemption of ultra-Orthodox Jews from military service, and supports the continuation of special welfare benefits for ultra-Orthodox Jews. This past month, police have recommended that Litzman be indicted for fraud and breach of trust in multiple cases, most notably the attempted cover-up of serial child molestation by ultra-Orthodox schoolteacher Malka Leifer. Also recommended for indictment is Interior Minister Aryeh Deri, leader of Shas. Deri was previously convicted of corruption when he was Interior Minister in the 1990s, and I guess old habits die hard. Shas began as a party for non-Ashkenazi religious Jews, but has largely become a more populist and belligerent version of UTJ. Now, the Unity Bloc comprises just one party, Yisrael Beitenu, led by Avigdor Lieberman. Various incarnations of this party have existed since the collapse of the Soviet Union as a voice for the interests of Soviet immigrants. Historically, it's been a very far-right party, but it has faced difficulty in recent years. Newer Soviet immigrants who have grown up under Putin skew much further to the left. And while the Soviet community in Israel has always been almost militantly secular, Yisrael Beitenu's continued allegiance to Netanyahu, and by extent his ultra-Orthodox coalition partners, has only hurt their interests. In the lead-up to the April election, Yisrael Beitenu was polling so poorly that I assumed it wouldn't win any seats in the Knesset, so I didn't bother talking about them. But ultimately, Yisrael Beitenu won 5 seats, which was just enough to keep Netanyahu from forming a majority government, and here we are. Yisrael Beitenu supports a 2-state solution, albeit a very idiosyncratic version of the 2-state solution that nobody else agrees with, a commitment to classical Israeli conservatism with its guaranteed rights to housing, healthcare, and education, a very aggressive national defense, and most visibly a steadfast opposition to religious coercion and religious power. To that end, Yisrael Beitenu has pledged to only support the formation of a unity government, in which Netanyahu will not be prime minister, and if opinion polling is any indication, they will be in an even stronger position to force that scenario than they already were. But key to arranging a unity government is the center-left bloc. Blue and White is the center party led by former IDF Chief of Staff Benny Gantz. His platform is focused on expanding LGBT rights, protecting Israeli minorities, fighting back against government corruption, rolling back religious coercion and special privileges for the ultra-Orthodox, and most of all, getting Netanyahu out of power. Centrist parties in Israel tend to be short-lived, and it looked like Blue and White would break up soon after the April election, But such is the sense of emergency regarding Netanyahu's various scandals, threats to the rule of law, and alienation of American Jews that they have stuck together. You might say the same of the Israeli left. Labor, led by Amir Peretz, supports more power for organized labor, is against the privatization of public assets, is pro-LGBT, pro-secular, and pro-minority, supports a very proactive path to the two-state solution, and seeks to increase economic and social development in the northern and southern periphery of the country. Labor is the current incarnation of Mapai, which effectively ruled Israel for the first 30 years after independence, but it's fallen a long way. In fact, it isn't even the most popular left-wing party. After coming in second place in last month's leadership race, Labour MK Stav Shafir left the Labour Party to become head of the Israeli Green Party, which then merged with the Social Democratic Meretz and the center-left Democrats to become the Democratic Union, led by Nitzan Horowitz. In terms of political spectrum, Labour and the Democrats are very close, probably even closer than in the days of Meretz. But the real difference is in the personalities involved as well as the priorities. The Democratic Union is pro-secular, pro-labor, pro-LGBT, and pro-minority. But it also wants to increase government transparency in order to fight corruption, work toward a two-state solution by immediately resuming the withdrawal of West Bank settlements, restore Israel to a position of global environmental leadership, and give legal recognition to reform in conservative Judaism. If Meretz was Bernie Sanders, then the Democrats are Elizabeth Warren. There's a plan. And for the purposes of disclosure, I am a member of the Labour Party, but I'm currently working with the Democrats. And that finally brings us to the joint list, led by Ayman Odeh. Back in 2015, the Israeli government raised the electoral threshold to 3.25%, or 4 seats. This was intended to prevent Israel's 3 largest Arab interest parties from getting into the Knesset, but what happened instead was that those parties merged into one superbloc called the Joint List. And while they broke up in the last election, they're back together now and consistently polling in a formidable 3rd place. Saying what the Joint List is for is honestly really hard, and it's almost impossible to imagine them as part of a government. While Arab parties used to be very common in Israeli coalitions, those parties were all eventually absorbed into the mainstream Jewish parties. The Joint List is really led by the communists, who do have Jewish members, but also have kind of an ambiguous attitude towards Israel's status as a Jewish state. And the union does include some questionable, conspiracy-minded factions like Balad. Now, normally I'd leave it at that, but the picture became a lot clearer a few days ago when Ayman Odeh announced that he would support a new government led by Gantz. And while Blue and White rejected this offer, the image of the Joint List, and especially of Odeh, has transformed from that of a spoiler for the center-left to a serious power player. And while most Arab Israeli voters do support the Jewish parties, this move in time could change the face of Israeli politics. Thanks for watching, and if you're an Israeli citizen, go out and vote there.